Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Anil Sharma, President and CEO of GMS. Welcome, Dr. Anil.
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here.
By way of introduction, just to recognize that GMS is one of the world's largest buyer of ships, rigs, offshore assets, which are all very important these days, as they always are, but ultimately shipping and offshore is very much in the news. And so we recognize your expertise in that area. Let's just start by your overall assessment, Dr. Anil, of the shipping space at the moment. A year and a half into this pandemic, there seems to be bottlenecks right through the value chain. Your outlook for all of those issues and how they could or will be resolved?
That's a big question. Let me see.
Take any part of it that you like.
Well, when it comes to, first of all, let me stay with shipping. And
yes.
I think if you're looking at the general consumer, he or she is most affected with the containers. So ships are really the three categories: are containers, dry bulk, energy, tankers, and gas carriers. So
all of them very relevant to us here in the Middle East, of course.
Brilliant. So let me start with the containers. So containers, as we all know, there's a big bottleneck. It's, of course, we are normally in the news for the wrong reasons. And for a while, it was Ever Given that just blocked that containers, the traffic that was blocked in Suez Canal, and the backlog and the shortage of chips in cars and commodities. The prices of containers have gone up. North America, Asia out. 40-foot container that used to cost $2,000 is costing now $9,000. So it's with a 4x. And I think those things are very relevant to an average consumer, And Christmas rush is upon us. It's very strange. I haven't seen that in more than 25 years I'm doing that. We own dry bulk vessels as well. And there is such a shortage of containers that actually people are chartering these dry bulk vessels to put containers on because there's a shortage of container ships just to make it for the Christmas rush from China to North America and to Europe. So that's the story in containers.
Even the airlines, apparently, Etihad Airlines is making most of their money at the moment with exorbitant money to be made on cargo, freight.
Yeah, in 25 years, I've never seen such a boom period for people who own container ships. So if you ever interview a container ship owner right now, he's very happy person right now.
Yeah, so usually they're miserable and all sorts of reasons to be upset. But right now, it's the sweet spot. Your thoughts on, is this a temporary moment? The Federal Reserve and most central banks want to tell us that this 4x inflation is a fleeting moment, and so they're not going to adjust policy around it. How sticky is this?
Well, I mean, it's I'm not an economist, and it's hard for me to predict. But I mean, the whole issue of global easing and quantitative easing, rather, I don't believe it's going to go away so quickly yet. And I see some traction there because the backlogs are there. Keep in mind, especially since we're talking containers, the backlog is also due to the problems in China with COVID. Chinese ports are very restrictive, and there's a huge backlog, and containers are being moved from one port to the other by land. And so the whole logistic chain is being messed up. And I believe it will definitely carry through 2021. And what it happens in Q2 of next year and so on, that's where the real story
hits. There seems to be that the sort of bottleneck, the inflation in the whole shipping supply chain isn't just on the water. Now we're seeing all sorts of shortages on shore with terms of truck drivers, longshoremen working on the ports. It's right through the whole structure that seems not easy to resolve in a short time.
Right. And I think partly it's all started with this COVID situation. I just came back from US, I think it was about 2 weeks ago. And all you hear and see ads for truck drivers and restaurant staff and hotel staff. I think, there's people just went home and for a year and a half and getting people back, even for the airline industry. So fortunately, in shipping, we still don't have crew problems in the sense the crew are there. What we are struggling is, getting crew off ships when their term expires and sending them home and getting replacements because just too many COVID-related restrictions on ports. So that's a big challenge, for
Well,
us in shipping.
we have what, about 1.6 million mariners, seafarer mariners that staff the world's fleet.
Right.
Many of them from countries where the vaccination rates are very low. How big a problem is that, and where is the resolution going to come?
Well, I mean, for example, India and Philippines are the two major, providers of crew. And in India, the vaccination drive has increased, but still, we are still struggling. So if we are hard to create a policy, it's only vaccinated crew. So that's our preference, but it's still slow.
We're seeing
So
some ports facilitate vaccinations for foreign crews.
it is the International Chamber of Shipping, some of the trade unions, there is a drive, and increasingly we are seeing some progress, but it has still been relatively slow.
And so from the point of view of where that goes moving forward, I mean, you say this is 4x on the freight, on the container, never seen before, but you've obviously been through some cycles of spikes and declines. Does this look anything? Is there any part of it that tells you this, at least it's 4 times X, but it's still a cycle that has a trend to it, and that trend tends to follow a certain course of action?
Well, I have not seen in the container segment, in the dry bulk and the tankers. So coming to the tanker segment, for example, we have seen there, but the cycles are normally, over the last 2 decades, the peaks and valleys are rarity. I mean, it's not, you normally have what I call kangaroo hops, people, cycles coming and going. The long bull and bear markets have kind of softened it out. But no, I haven't seen that. I mean, this is unprecedented. Of course, the tanker owners are not enjoying any of that yet. That altogether is a different segment. I think the dry bulk is also doing very well. I think the guys who are actually at the tail end are the tanker owners.
Why are they lagging in the context of the fact that so much supply is being kept off the market?
Right, and I think during the lockdown, there's just not enough demand for fuel, and I think even though it's coming back gradually, there's just combination of things, greater conservation of energy and change in energy and drivers to energy. I mean, you guys probably are more qualified to answer that.
Yeah,
it's just that the demand is probably not as much in storage.
Well, there was a period where floating storage got a lot of business when the market was in contango, not so much at the moment.
Right. I mean, strangely, ironically, the storage thing becomes quite, you have to be careful because there's a lot of the storage business is done in Malaysia and this part, and there are these issues of sanctions and so forth. So I think that segment also has a different angle to it.
Absolutely. When you look at the sort of the other aspects of the COVID pandemic and the impact it's had on the world, there's 2 things I wanted just to touch on with you. One is the impact on supply chain, and the other is the great energy transition. It's starting with the supply chain. We saw a lot of countries realize, oh my goodness, we're so dependent on China, we're so dependent on the cheap Asian producer. Now we've got car production facilities all over Europe, and America is shutting down because they can't get access to microchips out of various parts of Asia. Your thoughts on the impact, potentially the legacy? Will we see supply chains make a sort of tangible move away from Asia? What are your thoughts on the outlook for that kind of transition that we're hear a lot of talk about?
Oh, this is not my area of expertise, but I think I've been an academic person at one stage, so let me wear my academic hat.
Yeah,
I do feel, especially with the U.S. when President Trump was in in office, he tried to move a lot of business, industries back to America and
Yes.
with tax incentives.
Well,
And
certainly started that conversation in a very pronounced
right.
way.
So you saw that, and trade barriers and tariffs and so forth. So all this, definitely, production moved away from China. But a lot of the Chinese firms, these days, logistics is such a challenging part, isn't it? And
Yes.
so a lot of the Chinese firms moved to Vietnam. Vietnam, I think, was the single biggest beneficiary.
Yes, that was already underway before COVID because of the cost of production in China had grown so much. But I'm just thinking over the bigger frame of time that if supply chains move closer to their market and move, that has impact for shipping and the type of ships that people might invest in. But clearly, that's not coming on your horizon yet, so maybe not.
Well, geopolitical risk for most industries is important, but I think in shipping is probably one of the biggest risks, right? Because there are so much shifting trade patterns that everything can change. As I said, I alluded to, for example, sanctions, war, security apparatus. So I think it does impact shipping in a large way. What we call in the shipping business ton miles. So, for example, Australia, China spat, the dry bulk which was moving iron ore and coal from Australia to China, that suddenly had an impact.
Overnight, boom.
And so Indonesia to China business took off, now the Indians are coming back. So the Australia-India business that probably did not exist in coal, and that is coming up. The Brazil to China route. So I think shipping probably has a really significant impact of the geopolitical risk. So when anything happens in the world, and you saw whether it's a Suez Canal kind of an issue, it impacts. For an average person.
When you think of that geopolitical risk, obviously the supply chain issue is vis-a-vis China was ultimately a pandemic risk. The idea that production facilities were locked down, and so access to raw materials and all of the pieces that make the puzzle is complicated. But the other part of that, of course, is the carbon footprint, right? So as we move forward in terms of the great energy transition, we already saw shipping being hit last year with the IMO 2020. Let's just reflect on that a little bit. Went by without much of a hitch, really, it seemed.
Yeah, I think it overall it went quite smoothly. There was a lot of hue and cry, but I think owners accepted that. And because there were two simultaneous options, switching to VLS of very low sulfur fuel oils and the scrubber component. So some went the scrubber routes and some just made the switch more seamless.
Who's the winner? Who chose right?
I choose the very low sulfur fuel oil, VLSFO. I think scrubbers, even today, the gap is still about $90 a ton. Yeah. And the rule of thumb was you need to have excess $100 per ton spread between the heavy fuel oil and the very low sulfur fuel oil to make sense for the time of money you spend for scrubbers and so forth. So it never, for a short period, there was that $100 plus, but then it came 40, 50, 30, it just swung around in those regions. But more importantly, these open loop scrubbers, major ports started saying, we don't want you guys to discharge. I always believed, you don't want to carry refineries on board ships. That's not where it should be, right? It just didn't make sense.
Well, we might see another spike in high sulfur fuel oil now, where it might even be a premium to ultra low because of the cost of LNG and gas is going so high that there's a lot of buying of high sulfur for power generation. So you are competing in other ways when you stick with that option.
Right, but I think the great transition to use your expression is more on the alternate fuels. I think shipping is still slow to react to that.
Well, they've got a big target coming up, 2030 carbon. They have to be carbon zero.
Right, the net zero goal. For that we need to start looking at alternate fuels because the renewable energy component doesn't really work well in shipping with solar, wind, and any other. So you're really talking about For a while, there was a strong focus on LNG, and now there's still real debate between LNG versus methanol, for example. I think I was looking at the kind of traction ammonia is being talked about. I was at a global maritime forum where they were even talking about hydrogen, which to me was sounded very scary. But I think methanol seems to be is getting a little bit more traction. I think Maersk just put a dual fuel order
Yes.
for that. So
Well,
I
there's
think
certainly a
that's
lot.
coming.
Hydrogen is very much to the fore from the point of view of power generation. That's for sure. It's definitely it's having its moment in the sun, so to speak.
Right. But I think, in a way, if you think about it, why shipping didn't really make much progress in alternate fuels, of course, one is a cost factor, it's just and the availability and so forth. But also, because if you look at where the shipbuilding industry exists, it's really in Asia, Japan, Korea, and China.
Right.
And so I don't know what kind of subsidies the governments are giving to these industries. For a while, China had some subsidies, the shipbuilding yards, and the technology hasn't really taken off, right? So if you take a 10-year-old BMW and compare it with today's BMW, we can see a day and night difference.
Yes.
If you take a 10-year-old ship and compare it with today's modern vessel, it's very kind of incremental move. So I think that has not come into shipping yet.
What do you think of that? Obviously, it's 2022 in a few weeks' time, and hence it's getting, 2030 is only around the corner. It would seem like there's going to be a lot of ships getting scrapped. Your thoughts on that sort of ship? If one holds that line, 2020, everybody thought, oh no, they'll push it back. They never did. It became a sharp date. Everybody had to meet. 2030, there seems to be another kind of a creeping sense within the shipping community. Oh, they'll push the date. I don't need to move too quickly, but that's not too far away. There's going to have to be some big changes fast to meet those dates.
Well, my core business is ship recycling, so that's music to my ears because it means I'm in enough supply. But the other side is, what's the replacement? Because I think in a way I can see a real challenge. I don't want to say a storm coming up, but because the owners who want to put orders for new ships now today, because steel prices have gone through the roof.
Yes.
The cost of new building has gone high.
Yeah.
At the same time, there is not enough breakthrough technology. So it's like, do you really want to invest in a new ship at a higher cost with a lower, I wouldn't say lower technology, but with a technology that might be obsolete in another 5 years? That's a tough call. And so in a way, it's balancing. People are not going to rush and place orders in shipyards. And if 2030, I have all these ships that have to be recycled, then again, you might have another cycle of an upswing in freight rates. And the advantage is that freight as a component of the total value of a product is still low. Ship moving stuff by sea is still the cheapest mode of transportation. So there is enough room to to pass on those increased costs before the customers really start feeling the pain.
Well, if they start putting a price on carbon, I was looking at booking a flight today, and for the first time ever, as I looked up the flight, it had a carbon footprint for my ticket that I was going to buy. 1.6 tons or something like that, it said on the ticket. And maybe this time next year, we'll have to put a price on that 1.6 tons, which will make shipping and everything else a lot more expensive. Let's look at that, just finally wrap up with that point on decommissioning offshore assets. You talk about not a lot of appetite to invest in oil and gas at the moment. So tankers not getting a lot of funding. What about offshore assets? Where's your outlook for the sort of decommissioning business? Is that a growth business, do you think?
Yeah. One quick comment before
Please.
I answer your question, because you're talking about carbon footprint.
Yeah.
And I had my team in India send me a little stat which I thought was very interesting, which I did not think of. In last 10 years, about 3,000 ships were recycled in India alone. And we are the only company that measure the carbon footprint. And what was very interesting is that nearly 20 million tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse emissions was saved, meaning one of the big thing is sustainable, shipping, sustainable recycling, right?
Yeah.
And what is sustainable? I mean, there are different definitions and ESGs and so forth. But in essence, to me, it is the 3 Rs, recycle, reduce, and reuse. And,
Right.
and this part of the world, they do that. And I think the carbon footprint and all that, the more either you increase the life of a vessel, that helps. But if the ship is ineffective, then to recycle it in a sustainable way also is a big component, which I would say 99.9% of the world doesn't think of it that way. And it's a big story. I mean, we have stats we collect on the wood savings, the iron ore versus steel from ships. We can build more than 9,000 Eiffel Towers, 450 football fields.
Is there a particular market or a particular sector where recycled shipping steel ends up? Does it go any particular place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you Google ship recycling and stuff like that, the biggest challenge people have is they feel it's India and the Indian subcontinent, which recycles almost 85%
Yes.
to 90% of it, is because of cheap labor and poor environmental conditions.
Yes.
That's not the fact. The fact is not because I do business globally. It's because the steel that comes out of these ships, it's a bigger market. The US, the Western world has to export the steel to these foreign countries anyway. So all of this steel is used in domestic markets, and that has a premium price. This is not melted in furnaces. It's not a blast furnace. Some of that goes into arc furnaces, but the majority is re-rolled into bars and plates, and so it escapes the whole induction furnace, which that's why it's a big savings in energy and
well,
cost.
I think in so many ways, India is the leader in the circular economy because they've been doing it for so long on every front, including on the decommissioning of ships. Just quickly to wrap up on decommissioning of offshore production assets. Is that a growing business? Is there a geography relevance for that? They say the North Sea will have a lot of opportunities there.
Right. We've been doing this now for the last, I think, almost close to a decade now, but it really took off with semi-sub, the rigs, the jack-up rigs, the floaters, the drill ships. That sector, as you know, has really taken a sharp beating. I mean,
yes.
If you look at the vessels that, I'm just towing right now a vessel. There's a drill ship. I forget who had placed an order in China, and they abandoned the order. And the brand new ship the Chinese have just sold, they didn't complete the vessel. There's no one to complete this drill ship, so they just sold it to us for scrap, and we are towing it. It's pretty much a half-built vessel. So I've never scrapped so many modern vessels as I've done in offshore vessels. We have 2 drill ships, which is one is sitting in Oman, all going well, is going to depart tomorrow, I think, somewhere in Canary Islands. These are 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old ships that are being recycled. And when they build them, they probably build them at about $200 million, $100 million. Today being sold at the residual value of what, 10 million or something like that. So
and what's the logic there about that? Seems there's no amortization on that.
There's no amortization. Somebody's simply losing a lot of money. The only thing is there's most of these offshore companies are listed companies, so there's not one like shipping is dominated by ship owners. And very few are listed, whereas in offshore, it's a lot of OPM, right, or other people's money. So
well, we saw what 30% or so cut in capex investment last year across the energy sector, both oil and gas and renewables. A big hit, and it hasn't really come back yet.
Right. And it's not ending. I mean, we see the next few years to be busy. I think the biggest challenge in these offshore assets is also the logistics, getting them from point A to B. I mean, we have put them on semi-subs and, carry them halfway across the world. You talked about North Sea. That's not easy to bring the units from North Sea to the Indian subcontinent. So that's opening up. We have 3 rigs in that area. We are in discussions with yards in Europe to see how we can do that, because it just, the logistics don't make sense. So Turkey is a big beneficiary of the offshore units. But yeah, I think that sector is still have a lot of units to to
To
get rid of.
retire.
To retire, yeah.
Well, retiring at 8 sounds pretty reasonable. Dr. Anil Sharma, we could talk all day. It's one of my favorite subjects, shipping. I have to say, there's something very romantic about it. Dr. Anil Sharma, President and CEO of GMS, thank you so much for being on Halftime Talk this week.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Take care.